I'm Eric Hartman. I'm one of the founding members of the Choroideremia Research Foundation. I have been on the board for quite a number of years and then was president of the board, later became executive director, and I now serve as the director of advocacy for the foundation. And I've basically been with the foundation since it began 22 years ago. I was diagnosed at age 11. I was one of those rare people back in the 60s that had the correct diagnosis. My mother was adopted and we didn't know about the disease in my family. So it came as a complete shock to everyone. I was diagnosed by a retina specialist, but it was because I walked in from bright sunlight carrying a project into my school, and all the students were to get there early and they hadn't turned the lights on in the hallway. And I went to leave my project in front of the classroom and walked across everybody else's like Godzilla across the cities of these little miniature projects. And so the nun said either he's evil or he has something wrong with his eyes, which I said, which turned out I did have something wrong with my eyes. And I went to an eye doctor just to get a new prescription. And in Massachusetts, when they find somebody who's legally blind, they have to report them to the state agency. And that's how I got mobility training, and the mobility trainer told me about the Federation Fighting Blindness in Boston. I went to a meeting there, and one of the guys said, I know somebody with your disease, and it's her husband. And they gave me the number, and the woman said, you need to get up there doing this email group. You need to get a computer if you don't have one. I said, well, I don't have one. She said, well, as soon as you do. And she kept calling me. And then, finally got the dial-up modem, all that stuff. And it was eye-opening because literally Corey, who's one of our founders, he lives in Western Mass. And he and his wife drove out to meet me. And that's the first person with my eye disease, other than my brother that I'd met. I was age 40 at the time. The CRF is an amazing organization. We started with just a dozen or so people, and when in 2004, when the conference was there in New Orleans, we had 34 people, and all of us had never really spoken to an expert. Our retina specialists didn't know much about choroideremia except for what they read. So we literally were only able to get our Dr. McDonald and Dr. Ciabra to phone in. And it was like a scene from Charlie's Angels, 34 people looking at a little speakerphone. But it was like the Wizard of Oz. We were finally able to talk. And from that, we started funding research. And it started very basically. We knew we needed an animal model. So we began to fund Dr. Ciabra in London. And once the science caught up to the point they needed the animal, that's when we had the animal, and that helped put us in a position to be one of the first eye diseases to have a gene therapy trial. And we have pushed ourselves in the science. We've had people like Randy Wheelock, who was never satisfied with that we had a trial going and that we had to get more, because what if it didn't work? And we have gotten into induced pluripotent stem cells, which are samples. They took a sample from my arm and isolated the skin stem cells, which create pluripotent stem cells, which can make anything. And they're literally growing my retina cells with choroideremia in dishes in order to be able to do lab tests. So we've really, really grown. I was just at Retina International's World Congress in Reykjavik, and I was taken aside by the head of the Retina International and said that the Choroideremia Research Foundation is the global leader and best example of what a single disease foundation can do on a global scale for both science and patient support. And that was very, very humbling. I think coming to conferences is incredibly important. And I know it's a challenge for some families, and they may not be able to do that, but they can certainly avail themselves of our patient advocacy. We have lots of people like myself, other board members, or members of the board, or our our administration who are happy to talk to anybody, and we learn from each other. You learn you're not isolated, because certainly blindness, as the person affected, can be isolating. You become very fearful of going in crowds, but you can learn the skills of mobility. You can realize there are other people that are able to live very full lives even though they have low vision. For the parents, they can realize they're not alone. And there is something incredibly powerful about living your life more fully when you have hope. And there is hope. We've got a lot of trials and a lot of different ways that we're looking at trying to find what can be possibly done for choroideremia, both for the men that are affected, and there are women that are affected, but the female carriers, we're now studying it even more because we know female carriers can have certain phenotypical manifestations, which in layman's terms means they can have symptoms. And we want to find out what those symptoms are, because we as a foundation, the more we know about them, the more we can possibly work for a cure through neuroprotective agents or pharmaceuticals that might be able to slow the progression of the disease. What I want to be able to tell people is if there is a benefit of getting choroideremia versus some other rare eye disease, is that choroideremia is a very slow progressing eye disease, which means, we can experience a lot of life before restrictions become prohibitive for certain things. But that blessing of slow progression is also one of our greatest challenges to clinical trials. In order to show that the trials are working, to make sure that we are showing, the scientific term is efficacy, but to make sure that it's an effective trial, you have to wait a long time. It's not like the first Luxturna gene therapy for a different eye disease where suddenly they couldn't see and could, and the lights came back on. That's not going to happen for us. But there is so much going on, whether it's mRNA therapy, whether it is a therapy that isn't specifically for choroideremia, but can help sustain or slow the eye disease. Like there's a pharmaceutical group, I won't name them, but basically it could be a therapy that might be able to give us 10 or 12 or maybe 20 years more vision. These are the things that we're looking for. These are the things we're working for. And I think that there's really great hope in the idea of the advances in gene therapy with CRISPR-Cas9 and non-viral vectors. There's so much of this dynamic science out there that I truly have hope, and I want the people with choroideremia to realize there is hope. And the only way that we can ourselves make a difference is help us fundraise, get involved with the foundation. It will, one, make you feel better, but two, by all of us joining together, we are a much more powerful voice for change and to advance research.